terms of an interest in film, I would say that it was really, really unexpected and not deliberate. Really, my whole art career is kind of like that. I initially went to uni to study fashion and then dropped out. And then when I went back to uni, I studied textiles. And then when I was in my final year, which was 2020 slash 2021, we obviously had the pandemic. And we definitely had teaching and everything, but it became a lot more of a free for all. And so I started making these more sculptural pieces that kind of involved fabric, but like, yeah, not really. And within that, I ended up making a video, part advert, part music video. And it really kind of felt so exciting because I love music videos so much. I was always really, really obsessed with them, always like flip between MTV2, NME, Kerrang, but it always felt so unreachable. But when it came to making these really rudimentary videos, there was no one around. I was in my flat. And so there was none of that kind of embarrassment of not feeling legitimate. That, I guess, is where the interest in moving image then came in because of it's just sort of become quite a voracious interest and a huge part of my practice, which still involves textiles, but definitely more of a sculptural way. But most of these sculptures then being activated by video, and that video being sort of informed by different types of short form videos like adverts. And like when the music video channels would kind of like it would get to 10 o'clock and then they'd turn into infomercial channels. And so yeah, I just remember like if my parents were out late, then yeah, I just spend a lot of time watching JML. And even though I'm sort of looking maybe at lofty artist moving image now, I think the foundations of my interest in videos come from low mass culture, new product launches, that kind of thing. For those in peril on the sea, that was made for a solo show that I had at God's House Tower in Southampton. And the show was called Fechisos, which is the Portuguese word for an object imbued with magical powers. And it was sort of what the Portuguese in the 15th century called African religious spiritual objects, because the Portuguese were the first people, the first Europeans to make colonial contact in Cameroon, where I'm from, and then in lots of the sort of West African coastal countries as well. And they deemed the traditional religious objects like masks, they called it idol worship, and they quite dismissively chalked these very different religious practices up to the African people not having the ability for abstract thought. So they looked at fetchisos, which is where we get the English word fetish from, as heathen objects. And so I was thinking very much about traditional African religious objects and what some of these enslaved African people might have imbued power into in the hopes of sort of recrossing the Atlantic and returning home. And I was really reading a lot about the Drexian myth of an underwater land populated by the unborn children of pregnant enslaved mothers who'd gone overboard, slave ships. And then also really thinking about the myth of the flying Africans, which is a Gullah myth. So it's kind of like in low country America. And it was this myth that this group of enslaved African people en masse walked into the water and grew wings and flew back home. And it's inspired by a real life mass suicide in Igbo landing. And so I was thinking, is there a way to sort of invert that myth? And there's a way for them to enter the water and return home. And so I was thinking, okay, so what if these people found shipwrecked pieces of European maritime technology and imbued them with power to create magical objects that they could return home with? In the first kind of section, it is me thinking about this group of enslaved African people underwater as very optimistic engineers, and they've created this fetish object, but it's also kind of like a product. And so it's kind of looking at the language of kind of like it's like when Apple has a new phone and you see that kind of rotating product, and that kind of real optimism that a group of people have come together and technologically engineered something that is going to change all of our worlds. And then the second half of the film is sort of dealing with the reality of the timeline that we know and accepted history, and the fact that none of these recrossings could have happened in terms of recorded Western history. Who knows? Because I'm also very interested in the idea of water as this vessel for Black histories and unknown histories, and a place for speculation. So I saw the sculptures that I made as failed and defective versions because that's the only way that we in the present day would have access to them. And it's kind of overlaid with archival writings about these Portuguese and European encounters with Africans for the first time, and the derogatory language used, and the dismissive language used, and the racist language used. And then right at the end, it kind of thinks in a quite mournful way with the magical object laying on the beach. And it's got this kind of hazy oval vignette around it. And it's kind of thinking about kind of funeral cards that you maybe see from like an auntie on WhatsApp. And it's this very sort of like a visual language of modern mourning, definitely like amongst my like Cameroonian aunties and extended family. And that again was another thing which came into it, the idea of the sharing of Christian memes and repeated shared content. The idea of like this pictorial shared prayers and blessings and thoughts and prayers. The kind of really well-meaning but very like treacly visuals there. And I'm really interested in the degradation of when that gets shared over and over and it becomes maybe blurred or pixelated or it's a screenshot. And as someone really grappling with the strong Christian foundation that I've been raised in, but the fact that that has come from colonial mission work from Europe into Cameroon, I'm just really interested in the power that modern Christianity kind of holds still over me and over people I know. Nyanko and the Silver Gong. That was the last film that I made, and I worked really closely with Laura because the sort of idea of the central characters is that they are enslaved by Vikings, and then they escaped captivity and in onto an uncharted Scottish island and are sort of trying to reform an identity for themselves that's kind of outwith the realms of enslavement and, isn't necessarily African anymore, but isn't yet Scottish and is maybe a combination. And so as an English person in Scotland, there's a really funny context of, not necessarily wanting to like defend my Englishness, but also, when that is kind of ripped a bit, it's like, okay, well, there's also this like whole colonial history too. So within that, it felt really important to actually have a Black Scottish voice running through it. And so I kind of wrote the script as I would kind of speak, and then went to Laura and essentially asked her to kind of translate it into a mix of New Scots and Old Scots, the kind of equivalent of Middle English or Old English. And then also she was the voice actor for everyone in the film. And I think with the film, I really find myself kind of fascinated by overdubbing and bad dubbing. And I remember there was this Sunglasses Hut advert that I kept seeing recently, and it was this woman speaking English and everything was synced up and it seemed fine, but it was so creepy and something felt really uncanny and off to me. And it turns out she had been dubbed from an American accent into a British accent for the UK market. And it's really interesting to think that that's something that the corporation deemed important, but it's also something that really failed and really created something so strange and so off. And I think back to earlier adverts, like Chupa Chups adverts would always be like really badly dubbed from German or like Kinder adverts. So I thought it was really important for me to, while I was playing all the characters on film, to say all the lines in my RP English accent, and then have it overdubbed in Laura's Scottish accent and have that kind of visible.
Like it's one of my favorite classical plays to be in as a Scots play, uh, because the language itself is beautiful, and not a lot of people realize that Scots in itself is a language. And compared to Shakespeare, Shakespeare is great, but it sits really well naturally in my dialect, and also there's so many ways to emote using Scots words. So when I was going through the script for Kiali, it was actually pretty easy. It wasn't that stressful. I was a bit worried because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not like a big writer. I didn't study writing in uni, but just understanding the emotions of the characters, it meant that it was easy to attach the words. Like certain words that what Kelly had written down, I could kind of just merge together. For example, like don't do that, didn't do that. And the way Kiala speaks, she really enunciates. But the way I speak in a lot of like Scots language, you kind of merge words together.
The research that Kiali did and the thoughts that Kiali had about what she wanted everything to sound like. She presented to me also, in literal text, like as research, but also we had conversations and I'd sit with my laptop, I'd have my microphone, I'd make things, and Kiali'd be like, what if it sounded like this? I'd kind of translate that into what I need to on the program to because I use Ableton. A lot of people use Logic, but I think for electronic music and also for soundscapes and loops and things like that, Ableton is really good. I think working with Callie, there's subjects and topics that I think because I create essentially pop music, I feel like I can't talk about, I can't really explore. I think about like issues of identity and exploring identity and stuff, but with Kiali's work, we can be so much more informative, explorative, literal. You don't have to I guess give it that pop sheen. Whereas I think for me, when I would write my own things, it's like, okay, well, how am I feeling? It's reflective, it's cathartic. But I did underestimate like the cathartic element. I feel like Kelly and I, we've had very unique experiences as Black women in Britain, but also like the way we were raised and the environments we were in. So it is incredibly cathartic and incredibly interesting to have these works where we can look into what is our place in the world, what was our place in history, what is our place now. There was a big range of influences. Some of them were in like a Spotify playlist. We had things from this artist Drexia, but then we had influences like Nollywood films, and then we would think about influences that Callie and I enjoy musically, metronomy, Grimes, kind of integrating like film conventions and alongside the regular music, as well as trying to cut the music to like a film that has specific scenes.
And so I really asked Sarah Faith to think about the Cameroonian music that we had been exposed to growing up in terms of melody and in terms of emotion, and layering, but to use English words. And so she kind of ran with that and created this really mournful, really just like intense to listen to funerary song. And in the end, lyrically, she's just repeating under over and over again, which, yeah, I think is really sort of what happens when you're in a mode of panic or of grief. Like, you get repetitive, recurring, invasive thoughts, and there's often one idea or motif that you can't escape. And with Nianka and the Silver Gong, I'm a huge fan of Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, but so, I really wanted it to have this kind of high fantasy, Lord of the Ringsy feel where the central character is exploring these new territories. And so I actually came up with the little tune, but I sort of hummed it to her over a voice note and just said go. And yeah, she turned it into this kind of woodland, incredible odyssey of a soundtrack.
What's so amazing about Kiali is that she makes for the work. And so she knew, I need movement and I need physical performance in this work. I can't do that though. I need to get someone in that can. So that's how I kind of got brought into the multiple projects that I've worked with Kiali for. And then as those projects have gone, we've like developed a kind of working relationship. And her interests with diaspora and memory, how memory is physicalized through the body, definitely intersects with a lot of the work that I do. So we end up working really, really well together. What I will say is working as a performer for Kiali's work, I'm always in conversation with the objects. And Those in Peril was definitely very much that. The idea is, I was carrying these huge sculptures, these beautiful sculptures. So much of the movement for that was practical and having to use the limitations of that practicality to create an artistic output. And then especially then going into the sea and doing that's a whole other then. And so it definitely taught me, or it was a good example of a time when I've been, using my body as a vessel, which I think is then interesting conceptually for that piece in particular. For Nyinka being in a more advisory role, and with movement direction. Movement direction is a very interesting thing anyway. You're actually doing a lot less directing and much more listening, because it's about understanding what that person, that body is. What do they need? How do they move? What are their limitations? What are their strengths? And yeah, it was so nice to be able to then like share that back with her and like bring her out and bring her physicality out. And she's such an amazing performer, and there's so much richness in that. And I was really happy that she was like, no, I'm going to be the performer in this. I think it was perfect for that. I think actually the form of Nyinka made it a lot easier because she was leaning into the green screen and the awkward dubbing and like deliberately creating a digital landscape, and deliberately it's not supposed to be real. That frees you up practically, because then you're not having to sync the bodies perfectly. You're not having to align things perfectly. You're not having to make sure that the camera is in exactly the right place and you're set up in exactly the right angle and blah, blah, which means then you can play a lot more and you can have a lot more creative freedom. I think where the difficulty came is separating acting from performing, because I think what none of us wanted was for it to be acting. These are the roles and these are characters that you're playing. It's more complicated than that. It's like a slightly different embodiment as you're moving through. They're roles in the sense that they're fulfilling a purpose, not that they're a character.
When I was smaller, when I was 6 to about 8, I used to live in Côte d'Ivoire, and the plan was to relocate permanently. But then there was a coup d'etat, so we had to come back to like Reading. But that was a time in my life, and the only time in my life, where um I was completely surrounded by Black people as standard, and never felt like the odd one out, never had to think about race or Blackness as a um as a point of difference. And so it's always been that time in the Ivory Coast felt so, and I'm sure I look back at it with like the rose tinted glasses of youth, but I always remember it so incredibly fondly, and so kind of magically, as somewhere where I was like one of a shoal, like one of a throng. And I've always felt sort of at odds with wherever I am, whether that be, as a consequence of race or queerness, or yeah, just, generally being like a little anxious child. And in a lot of the art that I make now, I'm sort of thinking about my own heritage and being Cameroonian, and these like 2 maximum years that I lived in the Ivory Coast, like trying to hark back to these experiences that I am so fond of, but also like don't remember amazingly, or can't speak to knowledgeably, or misunderstand. And so that's something I think that's carried through.